Hi guys! Welcome back to Pro Studio Live and welcome to the Pro Tools Authority class. Last week we had our second episode which covered details on some of the windows in Pro Tools and the layout of the Pro Tools software. Today, in our third episode, we'll continue along the lines of what we were covering in episode 2, and we will cover detail on the other tools besides the zoom tool, which will include the trim tool, the selector tool, the grabber tool, the scrubber tool, the pencil tool, and the smart tool. We'll also get into some good detail on what each of the edit modes on the top left-hand side of your toolbar in the edit window do. And we'll go into more detail on some of the other subjects we touched upon previously, like some details of the timeline display, other toolbar items, and a lot more. Okay, so let's get started right where we left off last week and just begin with the trim tool. The trim tool is used for trimming off extra audio that you don't want to be included in a clip. So I'll just show you the trim tool really quickly. So this is the trim tool here. I have it selected. See how it's highlighted blue? That's how you know. So you just click on it to select it. Now, this can work with MIDI and video clips as well. So it's a non-destructive tool, which means it doesn't change the underlying file that lives on your hard drive. Because of that, you can trim any clip and then later use the trim tool to pull that part that you trimmed back out and return the clip to its previous length. When you first trim a clip, what happens is that Pro Tools will create a subset clip that it then adds to the clip list. This means that this trimmed version of the clip has its own distinct name on the clip list. So let me just show you how to use the trim tool. So we're in the trim tool here, right? So we're just going to hover on the edge of a clip and we're going to click and hold the click and then just drag to whatever length you want. So let's say I want to take this audio out. I'm just going to drag and let go and there it's trimmed. And then if I want to bring it back out later, all I have to do is click and hold and drag it back out. And there you go. That's how the trim tool works. It's that simple. So just like the zoomer tool, you'll notice there's a small arrow at the bottom of the trim tool button. This arrow means that there are multiple versions or options for this tool. So some alternate versions of this tool include the time compression and expansion tool, which is often labeled TCE, the loop trim tool, and in Pro Tools HD systems, you get the scrub trim tool, which is different from the scrubber tool, and we will go over the scrubber tool. But we'll get to the scrub trim tool at a later point. So I'll just show you those versions of the tool right here. So we have the trim tool. If we click and hold, then what we get is we have a drop-down menu that has the time compression expansion and that loop one. So we'll go into using those versions of the trim tool later. Okay, so the next tool is the selector tool. The selector tool is generally used for selecting a section of a track for editing or for playback or even for tracking. It can also be used to position the playback cursor without selecting a chunk of track or tracks. So let's look at that. Here's the selector tool. We're just going to click on it to activate it, and that's where it is. So to simply place the playback cursor somewhere in your track's display area, all you have to do is click with the selector tool in the desired location. So I'll show you that. I'm in the tool already. I'm just going to click and my cursor drops right where I click. It's that easy. To select an area of a track or tracks, you simply click and drag, and just keep in mind that you can do this over one track or you can do it over multiple tracks. So I'm going to do that. So I'm clicking and I'm holding my click and I'm just dragging, and I can do it over multiple tracks if I want. And then you have a selected area. Once you've selected an area, you can also hold the shift key to add to what you've selected or to take away from what you've selected. Once you're holding the shift key, you just click and drag to add or remove from what you've selected. So I'm going to show you that. So I'm going to hold the shift key. And I'm just going to click once here and show you how it takes away or adds. And I can add other tracks too into my selection. And it's that easy. I can click and drag and it brings it out or in. Okay, let's go over the grabber tool now. So the grabber tool is the little hand icon button. I'll show you that. Here's the grabber tool. I just activated it by clicking on it. So it can be used to move whole clips at once, either along the timeline or between tracks. You just go to the edit window and click and drag to move clips around with it. You can either move clips back and forth in time along the timeline, or you can move clips between tracks this way. So I'll just show you that really quickly in my session. So I have the grabber tool. If I just click once, it highlights that clip, and I'm going to just move it around. I can move it to different tracks. And because these are all stereo tracks, it easily moves. If I had a mono track above this track, then it would have trouble moving that to a mono. And if I had two monos, it would actually split my stereo track up into two mono tracks. Okay. So depending on what edit mode you're in, the clip movement and behavior when you use the grabber tool will change drastically. But we will cover those edit modes in a bit. So there are also some alternate grabber tool options called the object grabber and the separation grabber, which we can see when we click and hold on the grabber tool. Right, so it's kind of similar to the trimmer tool. So we're going to click and hold, and we can see the separation object tools, and we'll get into those in more detail later. Okay, so the smart tool. It's a multi-tool that you get when you select the trim tool, the selector tool, and the grabber tool at once. So you can do that by clicking on the bracket over all three tools, and you can tell it's active because all of those tools will be highlighted in blue. I'm just going to show you that really quick. So here's that bracket that covers those three tools, and I just click on it and it highlights all three, and now I'm in the smart tool. The smart tool is good for using all the functions of all three of these tools, and it's also good for doing fades and crossfades. I actually use the smart tool a lot, and I probably have it active more often than not. The thing you should really know about the smart tool is that where you hover your mouse on the clip or note will determine which tool you're currently using. So if you hover towards the bottom of a clip, you'll see the smart tool become a grabber tool. I'll just show you that really quick. So I'm in the smart tool, and whenever I go towards the bottom of a clip, it becomes the grabber tool. So then it's that tool that's, again, easy to move clips around with. If you hover towards the top half of the smart tool, it will become the selector tool. So again, we hover and we see it become that selector tool for highlighting chunks here. If you hover towards the ends of the clip, so in other words, the beginning or the end of the clip, right? You'll see the smart tool become a trimmer tool, which is that bracket icon that we saw. So see that bracket appears, and now I can trim. So it's a great way to access all of these tools quickly without having to switch between tools. Once the smart tool is displaying the tool that you want to use, you simply use it as you would normally use that tool. Okay. So next is the scrubber tool, which lets you slowly scrub along audio tracks and clips. And it's good for finding a specific point in your audio. It sounds similar to how people scratch records, if you've ever heard that. But actually, this technique for audio editing and finding your location in the audio originated in tape editing back in the day. So engineers would actually rock the tape back and forth over the playhead to find a spot to splice, or just to find any position in the audio that they were looking for. So to use the scrubber tool, you just select it, and then you click over the audio that you want to scrub in the edit window. And then you just drag right or left to start playback wherever you're clicking. So I'm going to show you the scrubber tool right here. You just click on it to highlight it. And depending on which direction and how quickly you drag your mouse, the direction and speed of the playback will change. So because of this, you can get more precise if you zoom in on whatever section of audio you're looking at. So let's just use the scrubber tool really quickly. I'm going to actually zoom in a little bit. And I'm clicking and I'm holding the click, and then I'm dragging. And you can hear that it scrubs the audio, right? That's what we call it. So you can also scrub two tracks at once. So the scrubber tool is just another way to listen and find what you're looking for, basically. Okay, so the next thing we should cover is the pencil tool. You can easily spot it because it looks like a pencil. So here's the pencil tool. I'm going to click it, and now I'm in the pencil tool. To use the pencil tool, you have to be zoomed in all the way to the sample level. So I'm just going to zoom in really quickly here on something. I'm not really very particular about what I'm zooming in on. I want some waveform though. Okay. So basically, the pencil tool is used to redraw a waveform, which is useful for dealing with visually obvious waveform issues, like a quick pop or a click. So, for example, a pop in the audio will usually display as a quick spike in the waveform. So you could redraw that spike so that it's not a spike anymore, and that would seriously diminish any disturbance in your audio. I'll just show you how to redraw over the waveform here. I don't have a pop in this audio, but you just kind of pick a spot and you draw over it and see how it rewrites that waveform. Okay. That must sound pretty horrible, but you know. It's important that you remember that the pencil tool is destructive. So that means that it will alter your actual audio file on your hard drive. So once you make the edit, I really recommend making an immediate decision about whether to keep the edit and continue working, or to use the Apple Z command to undo your edit. The pencil tool can also be used in MIDI data. So it has a few types of shapes that you can select: freehand, line, triangle, square, and random. I can just show you that really quick. It's just like with the other tools. You click and hold on the tool and it opens up a drop-down menu with all the different options. So with these shapes, you can enter notes with different velocities and durations, and you can edit and draw automation and MIDI control data. So for example, you could use the triangle to create a nice pan, use the line for volume, or use the square or random to set velocity. Before we move on from the tools for now, I want to mention a good quick way to recall and move around with these tools. So certain keys on your keyboard are actually mapped to these tools. However, they're the F keys. So in some later versions of Mac OS X, the F key, all the F keys might control different aspects of the operating system by default, which means those functions would actually override the F key functions in Pro Tools. You can fix this by going to the Apple menu on the top left of your screen and choosing System Preferences and then selecting Keyboard. I'll just do that really quickly. So this is the Apple menu, right? You get a System Preferences, and then you're going to pick Keyboard. And then you just check the box that says use all F1, F2 keys, etc. keys as standard function keys. So I have that already checked, but it's this checkbox right here. You just want to make sure that's checked. And then all you have to do is close the System Preferences and you're all set. So your F keys will now control Pro Tools functions as expected. So F5 will activate the Zoom tool, F6 will activate the Trimmer tool, F7 will activate the Selector tool, F8 will activate the Grabber tool, and F9 will activate the Scrubber tool, and F10 will activate the Pencil tools. So you should be able to get the hang of these keys pretty quickly if you remember that F5 will activate the tool farthest to the left, and that the F keys in sequence will control the tools in the same order that they appear from left to right. So I'm just going to press those really quickly. So I have F5 activates that Zoom tool. F6 activates the Trimmer tool. F7 is activating that Selector. I'm hitting F8 now for the Grabber. F9 is for the Scrubber, and F10 is for the Pencil tool. To activate the Smart tool with these keys, you just press any two of the F keys that correspond to any of those three tools within the Smart tool. So for example, you can press F7 and F8, which are for the Selector and the Grabber at once, or you can press F6 and F7 for the Trimmer and the Selector at once, or you can press F6 and F8 for the Trimmer and the Grabber tools. Any of those combos will activate the Smart tool. So I can show you that really quickly. I'm just going to press the Selector and the Grabber, which is F7 and F8, and it activates that Smart tool. I'm going to do the Trimmer and the Selector, which is F6 and F7, again, activates it. I'll go off it first so you can see. Activates it. So it's pretty simple. So for tools with multiple options, like the zoom or the pencil tools, you can cycle between those multiple options just by pressing their F key repeatedly. So for example, if I press the F10 key repeatedly, it will cycle through the different pencil tools, right? So I'm going to hit the F10 key, which is for the pencil tool, and I'm just hitting it repeatedly. And you can see the little icon for the different pencil options changing as I press it. Okay, so let's move on to the edit modes. If you remember from earlier in the series, we have 4 main edit modes: shuffle, slip, spot, and grid. You can select these using the buttons on the top left of the toolbar in your edit window. Just like with the F keys for tools, there are F keys that are mapped to the different edit modes. So pressing F1 puts you in shuffle mode, F2 puts you in slip mode, F3 puts you in spot mode, and F4 will put you in grid mode. So I'll just show you that really quickly. So I'm hitting F1, shuffle, highlights, becomes highlighted. F2 highlights slip, F3 highlights spot, and F4 highlights grid. So again, if you're having trouble getting the F keys to select these modes in Pro Tools and you're on a Mac, just go to that keyboard section of the System Preferences dialog and check the Use All F1, F2, etc. keys as standard function keys option. Anyway, these edit modes affect how audio, video, and MIDI clips, as well as MIDI notes, are moved and placed. So depending on which mode you're in, your edit tool functions can behave differently, and some edit commands like copy or cut and paste will behave differently. So let's go over the shuffle mode first. Shuffle mode constricts the movement of the clips based on the location of other clips. So what that means is that when you try to move a clip in shuffle mode, it either won't move or it will snap to the nearest clip. I can just show you that really quickly. I'm going to press F1 to go into shuffle mode. I'm going to zoom out so we can see what we're doing. You can see that lovely pop that I made on that audio with the pencil tool. All right. So basically, I'm going to try to move a clip, and you will see, I have to be in the grabber tool. You will see how it wants to snap to the nearest clip. So see that yellow line? That's where it's going to end up when I let go. So it won't let me just freely drag it anywhere. So also, if you cut or delete or paste or duplicate or trim material, the clips will either open up to make just enough space for any material you added, or they will shift to close the gap created by any material you removed. So I'm just going to add some material, remove some material here. So I'm going to use the trimmer tool for that. I'm just going to click and drag it out and see how it actually, this one actually moves with the end of the other clip. And again, if I remove some audio here, it'll snap to the end. And that also works if you delete audio. So I can actually highlight and delete and it'll snap together. The advantage here is that in shuffle mode, any clip that you move will automatically line up next to the closest clip, which leaves no gap and no overlap between the two. So this makes it a useful mode for doing stuff like voiceover editing. What you can do is you just leave Pro Tools recording once you're in the studio with the voiceover artist and let them continue to do as many takes of each phrase as they want, so that they don't need to notify you with each take. And this way, it's faster for the voiceover artist, which makes them happy and can save the client money, really, depending on who the voiceover artist is and what their rates are, because voiceover artists can be really expensive. But anyway, as you're tracking, you just drop markers whenever they do a decent take of a phrase. And then when you get to editing, you can start at the end of your audio that was recorded, and just using the shuffle mode, you can cut out the sections of audio that weren't one of the good takes, and you just reduce it from there. Since you're in shuffle mode, the good phrases that you leave in the session will snap to one another as you go, meaning you won't have to line them up next to each other at the end of editing. You'll just have to do fades and stuff. Okay, so next is the slip mode. In contrast to shuffle mode, slip mode lets you move clips about freely. So when you move something or cut, copy, paste, etc., it won't affect the placement or location of other clips on the track at all. So while in shuffle mode, you can't simply place a clip halfway between two other clips, but in slip mode, you can. So I'll show you that really quickly. So we're in slip mode, and I'm just going to move my clip about freely. So again, remember it was up here before, and when we clicked and dragged it down to this track, it snapped next to this other one. So in slip mode, it doesn't, and you can just drop it wherever you want. So you can also place a clip so that it's partially or completely overlapping another clip while in slip mode. And this is another thing that you can't do in shuffle mode, right? So I'm just going to show you really quickly. I'm clicking and dragging, and it jumped a little, but it's overlapping the other audio. And that is allowed in slip mode. So slip mode is good for when you want to edit using the edit tools, but you don't want to worry about how your edits might move other clips in the track. So it's for when you specifically don't want other clips to automatically move about in response to what you're doing. Okay. So next is going to be spot mode. Spot mode is very specific. It lets you immediately move clips to very specific locations in your session. When you put your session into spot mode, every time you try to move a clip, it will actually open up a dialog box that asks for a specific location. So I can show you that really quickly. I'm just going to hit F3 for my spot mode. And now I'm in spot mode. You can see it highlighted. And I'm going to click this clip to try to move it, and it automatically opens up this dialog box. So once you're in the dialog box, you simply select the unit of measurement, then enter the specific time location for the clip you are moving. You can enter into this dialog box the start time, the end time, the duration, and sync point, which is something we will go over later for your clip. So spot mode is great for when you're doing something like post-production, where you might get a specific numerical time location, probably in time code if it's post-production, where something needs to be. Other than the dialog box, though, when something moves in spot mode, it behaves very similarly to slip mode, in the sense that when you shift, move, delete, or add to a clip, it doesn't affect the location of other clips in the track. So I'm just going to move my clip really quickly, and you will see that happen. So right now it's at 44 seconds, so I'm going to move it to 54. I'm going to hit OK and see how it shifted that clip, but it didn't shift this other one. Okay. So next is grid mode. Grid mode is really useful for music production. Things like audio, MIDI, and video clips, as well as MIDI notes, will snap to the nearest grid time increment. So the nearest time increment is determined using the time scale and grid size, which can be an absolute or relative unit of measurement. Grid mode is great for getting notes to snap to the beat. So for example, you can set the grid time increment to be every 8th note on a 120 beats per minute session, or BPM, right, is another way to say beats per minute. Then, when you move notes or clips about, Pro Tools will snap them to the nearest 8th note, meaning you don't have to spend an absurd amount of time lining up your notes. We will go over how to do that in more detail later. Just know that I'll show you grid mode right here. So this is grid mode. And again, we went over, you can use the F4 key to pick grid mode. So just hit F4 and it goes into grid. Okay. So let's move on to the rulers and the time scales. So as we mentioned previously, you have a main time scale and a sub time scale in Pro Tools. You can see them in the toolbar section of the edit window, which, if you remember, the toolbar section is up top here in the edit window. And here we have our main time scale. Is this, right now I'm at 54 seconds, right? Because I use that spot mode to move my clip. And then the sub time scale counter is right here below the main time scale counter. So it's good to know that the main time scale and not the sub time scale is what is used for transport functions like selection start, end, and length, as well as the grid values, which brings us back to the grid mode, right? And nudge values. So the sub time scale is just an added reference for you to use. So the unit of measurement can be changed for the main time scale, but it always measures from the start point of your session. So your options are minutes and seconds, bars and beats, time code, samples, or feet and frames. The units that you choose for the main time scale affects the units that are used for other things, which include the main counter in the edit window, the main location indicator in the transport window, the selection start, length, and end values, and pre and post roll values, as well as the initial grid and nudge values. So to set the value of the main time scale, you can either go to the view menu and select main counter and choose your options, which I can show you really quickly. So I'm going to the view menu and I'm just going to select main counter here. And here you see those options that I mentioned earlier: bars and beats, minutes and seconds, time code, feet and frames, and samples. Or you can go to the main counter at the top of the edit window, right, and click on the drop down arrow at the right to open up the main timescale pop-up menu and pick your unit of measurement. So I'll just show you that really quickly. So you just go here to the main time counter, right, and you click this little arrow. If you can see it, it's a little drop down arrow, and here you have those options. And you can just click one to choose it. So I'm going to switch this to time code really quickly. And you see how the numbers change because it's now in time code. Or if the ruler for the unit of measurement that you want is displayed in the rulers section, you can also click on that ruler until it's highlighted, and that will automatically change the main time scale to that ruler's unit of measurement. So I can just show you that really quickly. Let's see what rulers I have here. So I can click on minutes per second, and if you look at this main counter, you can see it change. So right now it's in minutes and seconds because I highlighted that. But if I go back to time code, it changes back to time code up here for the main counter. But since there are some units of measurement for rulers that aren't available as the main time scale unit, there are also a select group of rulers that you can click to successfully change the main time scale. So you're not going to be able to click every single ruler that you have in that ruler section in order to change the main time scale. Again, it's just those 5 units of measurement. So minutes and seconds, bars and beats, time code, samples, or feet and frames that you can use for the main time scale. Okay, so let's move on to the sub time scale. Like I said earlier, the sub time scale is just a secondary reference for you to use. It's there for convenience purposes mostly. Its default is set to samples. You can set the sub time scale to the same units as the main time scale. So the options are minutes and seconds, bars and beats, time code, samples, or feet and frames, right? So if you're not already seeing the sub time scale at the top of the edit window in the toolbar below the main counter, then you can click to open up the main time scale pop-up menu and pick the show sub counter option. I can just show you that really quickly. So basically, right now it's showing, so it says hide sub counter. But if I click that, we just see the main counter. And then if we click on the drop down again, we see that show sub counter option, and you just click on that and it'll open up that sub counter. So that's how you get that if you don't already see that. So this opens up the sub time scale for you to see below the main time scale. And it also makes available a sub time scale drop down menu where you can choose the unit of measurement for the sub time scale. So again, that's this little arrow. It looks just like the one on the main time scale. And it has the same options. So I can switch things around. I can make this feet and frames if I want. So let's return to the rulers in Pro Tools. You have a bunch of rulers to choose from in the timeline display area towards the top of the edit window, and those help you navigate along the timeline. So there are rulers for all the time formats that you can select for the main and sub counters, and beyond that, there are some rulers for units of measurement that aren't included in the main and sub counter options. As we mentioned in a previous episode, there are 2 types of rulers in Pro Tools. So there are time-based rulers and there are conductor rulers. So time-based rulers will include feet and frames, time code and time code 2, samples, minutes and seconds, and bars and beats. And the conductor rulers include chords, key, meter, tempo, and markers. So we touched upon this in a previous episode, but to select which rulers are displayed, you can either go to the view menu and then select rulers and pick which ruler you'd like to display, which I can show you really quickly. So we have the view option here, and we're just going to go down to rulers, and here are all your options. So you have a lot more options than the main and sub counters, right? Or you can use the ruler view selector, which is that drop down menu at the top left of the ruler section. So I'll show you that really quickly. It's this little square here, and if you click on it, you have all the same options for your rulers. Again, if a ruler has a check mark next to it, then it's displayed currently. And if it doesn't have the check mark next to it, then it's not displayed. To make a ruler disappear from the ruler section, you can also hold the Option button or Alt in Windows and click on the name of the ruler towards the left of the ruler section. And that's what's called the ruler's nameplate, right? So I'm just going to do that really quickly. So I'm going to hold Option. I'm going to get out of this drop-down menu. I'm going to hold Option, and I'm just going to click on the ruler, and it disappears. So that's another way you can get rid of it besides using the drop-down menus. If you remember from episode 2, we learned that a lot of functions in Pro Tools are actually reversed if you hold the Option key or the Alt key in Windows, right? So if you think about it, this is a similar concept since it hides or reverses the state of the ruler when you hold Option and click. And you'll see as we go that some other things can be hidden using Option and clicking. So one thing to note is that you can't hide the ruler that is currently assigned as the main timescale ruler, which is the one that's highlighted in the ruler section, if you remember. And as we mentioned in the last episode, you can click and drag on the ruler's nameplate to reorder the rulers. So I'll just show you that again really quickly. So I'm going to add a few rulers here. I'm going to add feet and frames. I'm going to add samples. And now that I have a few, I can just click and drag them around and change the order easily. Okay, so let's cover some details of the MIDI controls. So far, we've discussed how you can find MIDI controls in both the toolbar section of the edit window and in the transport window. So I've shown you what the MIDI section looks like before, but I'll just show you again just to reiterate it. So this section is the MIDI section, right, with these buttons in this area here. But so far, we haven't talked about what each of these MIDI controls do. So basically, the MIDI controls give you options for playing back and recording MIDI data in your session. So the MIDI controls include a tempo field, a meter display, tempo, ruler enable, MIDI merge, count off, a metronome, and wait for note buttons. I've taken a screenshot and I've actually labeled these controls for you so you can get a good sense for what these things are within the MIDI controls section. So I'll just show you that really quickly. So I'm going to go to my desktop and open up this image for you guys. And I don't know if you want to take a screenshot yourselves to reference later. But I would recommend doing that. So since there are so many controls in one small space, it can be useful to reference a labeled image like this until you have it memorized at least. Okay, so let's start with the wait for note button. Its icon is a pause symbol next to what looks like the ends of a MIDI cable. So you can turn on the wait for note mode by clicking this button until it's highlighted. There's also an option where you can activate or deactivate wait for note using the F11 key. And to turn on the setting, all you have to do is go to setup and then preferences and then the MIDI section and then check off use F11 key for wait for note. So I'm going to show you that really quickly. I'm just going to get out of this image. So setup and then down to preferences. And then we're going to find the MIDI section, the MIDI tab here. And then here's the option right here. Use F11 key for wait for note. And you just want to make sure that's checked. Okay. So when wait for note is on, recording won't begin until a MIDI event of some sort is received. So this means that even though you might be in recording mode with your MIDI track record enabled, it won't start tracking that MIDI until you hit the keys on your MIDI keyboard or whatever your trigger system is, right? So this ensures that the machine won't start recording until you're ready to play. It also makes sure you don't accidentally record any unnecessary silence over something useful that you'd like to keep, right? Okay, so next to that is the metronome button. So the metronome button looks like a traditional triangular metronome. So here we go. We have the metronome button. Mine's actually enabled. So when you click it, I'm going to click on that. I'm going to click on it to unhighlight it. It's disabled, and then I'm going to click on it to highlight it. So basically, it becomes active if it's blue, right? And what that means is that you will hear a metronome during playback and recording. So you can control how fast this metronome sounds by going to the click count off options dialog box, which you'll find by going to setup and then click count off. So I can show you that really quickly. We're going to setup and then we're going to click count off. And here's that dialog box for you to see. So you might already be familiar with the more common way to enable the metronome, though, which is to create a click track in your session. And we'll cover the details of how to do that later when we get to the tracks section. But you should just know that creating a click track is the more common and a simpler way to enable the metronome. So to modify click settings, you can go to this click count off dialog by going to setup and then click count off, or you can also go to it by double clicking on the metronome button in the MIDI controls section, because when you do that, it will pull open that dialog box for you. So I'll just show you that really quickly. I'm going to close out of the dialog box and I'm just going to double click here and it opens it up for me again. So some of your options in this dialog box include options for when the click plays, so during play and record, or only during record, or only during count off, and note velocity and duration of the accented and unaccented beats. So to toggle the click or metronome sound on and off, you might find it more useful to press 7 on your numeric keypad. So this function is on by default, so you shouldn't have trouble making that 7 control the click. But if you do, just keep in mind that you need the numeric keypad mode set to transport for it to work. So you can find this option by going to Setup and then Preferences and clicking on the Operation tab and then looking at the Transport section. So I'm going to do that really quickly to show you where it is. So Setup and Preferences, right? And we're going to find that Operation tab and we're going to look for that option, right? Which is numeric keypad mode, which is right here. So numeric keypad, and you just want it set to transport. Okay. So now let's look at those count off controls at the top of the MIDI controls section. So if you see the words count off at the top and notice whether those words are highlighted, then you know if count off is enabled. So if the words count off are highlighted, then Pro Tools will count off a selected amount of bars before the playback or your recording begins. So I'll just show you that right here. So that's this section right here. So right now it's highlighted. And then if I click it again, it becomes unhighlighted, right? So that's where it is. You can see to the right of those words how many bars will be counted before your playback and or recording begins. So this area where the number of bars is represented is actually called the count off field. So just like with the click, you can go to Setup and select Click Count Off to open up that Click Count Off options dialog box. I'll open it up again just to show you. So I'm just going to Click Count Off and Setup. And it opens it up again. It's the same dialog box. You can also open this box by double clicking in the edit or transport window on the count off field. So I'll show you that. It's similar to just double clicking on the metronome, right? But it's right here in the count off field. Oh, I'm sorry. It's right here. And it opens it up for you. So in the bottom of that dialog, you can select how many bars make up the count off. So you can you can pick and choose exactly how long you want this count off to be. So let's say 3 bars is kind of a long time. I can make it 2. I can make it 1. I can make it 1, or I can make it like 6 bars if I really want some more time. So you can also toggle the count off on and off using the 8 key on the numeric keypad. But again, like the 7 with a click, you have to have numeric keypad mode set to transport. Okay, so let's return to the buttons along the bottom of that MIDI section and look at the next button, which is known as the MIDI merge button. So the MIDI merge button looks like one arrow intersecting and joining the path of another arrow. And so this is the button right here with the arrows. You can use the number 9 on the numeric keypad to toggle MIDI merge mode on and off, as long as the numeric keypad mode is set to transport. Or you can click the button to toggle the MIDI merge mode on and off. So I'll just kind of show you that really quickly. So it's on now, and now it's off. So when MIDI merge mode, when the button is highlighted blue, that means that the MIDI merge mode is enabled. What MIDI merge mode does is it makes it so that while you're recording, any new MIDI data that you record will be merged or combined with the existing MIDI data on the track. So this means that it won't erase or overwrite previous data. It'll just join that data. So when the MIDI merge mode button is deselected or isn't highlighted blue, that means it's in the standard replace mode, where MIDI data that you record will replace any existing track data. So next is the tempo ruler enable button, which is better known as the conductor button, right? Because it looks like a little conductor. So you click on the button to toggle it on and off, just like the other buttons, and I'll show you that right here. So here it is. It's the little conductor, if you can see it. I'm just going to click on it to toggle it on and off. When it's on or enabled, Pro Tools will use the tempo map, which is determined by the tempo ruler, right, which we covered earlier. And it will use that tempo map to control the tempo throughout playback and recording. So when it's not selected or not enabled, Pro Tools will be in manual tempo mode and won't pay any attention to the tempo map. When in this manual tempo mode, you can manually set the tempo by either tapping in a tempo, which is something we'll cover a little later, or by typing in the value that you want into the tempo field. So you'll notice that if I make sure the conductor is deselected, I can then enter a specific value for the tempo in that tempo field. So I'm going to do that really quickly. So it's deselected. I can then enter whatever I want. I can make it 140. I can return it to 120. And then if you notice, when I click on that conductor button, it's not an option anymore. So I can't type in the tempo when it's active because it's using that tempo map, right? Okay. So let's move on to the meter display. So the meter display is basically just that middle row of text in the top half of your MIDI controls section. So I'll show you it really quickly. It's where it says meter here, and then it's this middle value, right, which is 4/4, which is a type of meter in music. So it tells you the session's current meter, depending on where the play location is. So you can double click on the meter display to open up a meter change dialog box and to have the chance to make a meter change. So I'll show you that really quickly. Oh, I'm clicking on below that. And there we go. We have the meter change option. It's kind of a small area to click on, so it's kind of tough to get sometimes, but there it is. So the meter change is placed where your location cursor currently is, and it will continue after that point until you make another meter change, right? So I'll just make a meter change really quick so you can see that. So I'm going to make this 3/4, and my cursor currently is, I guess it'll be at the beginning of this clip, but because the clip is highlighted. So if I do that and hit OK, what we're going to notice is if you look at this meter value right here, if I click before that value, it should return to what it was before, which is 4/4. And then if I click after, it makes it 3/4. And it goes all the way up to this point where my cursor was. Okay. So let's look at the tempo field. So the tempo field is that bottom row of text in the top half of your MIDI controls section. It shows you the session's current tempo, depending on where the play location is, if the conductor button isn't highlighted, right? And if you're in manual tempo mode. In that case, you can enter the BPM, right, which we covered earlier, by typing it into the tempo field. So you can also tap the tempo into this field if the field is selected so that the BPM numbers are highlighted. So my button is off, right? My conductor button is off, so I can do that manual tempo mode that we covered earlier. I clicked on it, now it's highlighted. And to tap your tempo in, all you have to do is you can use a MIDI controller, or you can simply tap the T key on your computer's keyboard. So I'm just going to tap the T key because I don't have a MIDI controller attached here. But if I just tap, you can see the tempo changing according to how I tap it. So that's great if like a musician's playing, warming up, and you want to figure out the tempo and they don't know the exact tempo. You can just tap it in right there and figure it out, get a rough idea, and then adjust it from there. Okay. So now that you have some Pro Tools basics under your belt, let's return to creating a session and discuss some of those session parameters in more detail. So you might remember from our first episode that we discussed the importance of opening the Pro Tools software first and then selecting opening or creating your new session. So when you do this and you open up Pro Tools, you should see that quick start dialog box that we touched upon, as long as you haven't deactivated that option already, which is something you can do. So I'm just going to close my Pro Tools out and I'm just going to restart it. So I'm going to hit quit. I'm going to say don't save. I'm going to close that because we don't need that anymore. I'm going to start up Pro Tools. And then what I should see is that quick start dialog box because I haven't deactivated it, right? So this quick start dialog box, here it is right here. It gives you those quick options for opening or creating a new session. So it gives you options like open session, open recent session, create blank session, or create session from template. And to toggle between these four options without a mouse, it's possible to do so. You can just hold Command and then press the up or down arrows on a Mac, or hold Control and hit the up and down arrows if you're on a Windows machine. So I'll just show you that really quickly. So I'm going to hold Command and I'm just going to do the up and down arrows. You see it cycles between these options. So that's a good way to just quickly pick whatever you want, right? And then you just hit Enter when the option you want is selected, and it'll open up the dialog depending on what the option is. So it's good to know that your Pro Tools install comes with some factory session templates that you can use when you're selecting the create session from template option. But you can also create and save your own templates. So it's a great feature that a ton of engineers use, and it can save you a lot of time. But we'll go into more detail on how to do that later. You should just know that that's an option for you to do. And I can just kind of show you those. Let's see, create session from template. There's a few options here. Anyway, when you pick create session from template or create blank session, Pro Tools will create the main session folder that we discussed earlier in this course with its respective subfolders and files. But to control the characteristics and details of your recording within your session, you can look at and change the session parameter settings. So now we pointed out that these session parameters exist in a previous episode, and we learned a lot of the basics about what things like bit depth and sampling rate control. But it's important to realize that that background knowledge becomes applicable as soon as you go to create a new session. So to set your session parameters, just click on the arrow where it says session parameters in the dialog box. And this is called the session parameters reveal button. And this will cause the session parameters dialog box to open up and expand to display your audio and input and output parameters. So right now mine's open already, but it could be closed for you like this. And you just click here and it opens it up. Okay. So if you remember from earlier in the series, you can also access a similar window with the session parameter settings by going to File and selecting New Session. So these session parameter settings have options for your audio file type, your bit depth, your sample rate, and your input and output settings. So first, let's go over the audio file type in a little more detail. So Pro Tools can store audio files on the hard drive in either WAV or AIFF format. So that's why if you click here, you'll see those are the options, right? WAV or AIFF. So Avid recommends that you use WAV. So WAV is the default file type. It has better compatibility across platforms, and it's recommended that you just stick with WAV unless you know that you'll be mostly importing audio that's in another file type like AIFF, right? So, okay. So let's look at the sample rate. Now we discussed what exactly sampling rate is in episode 1 of the show, but how do you decide which sample rate to choose? So first of all, the higher the sampling rate, the more data storage space you'll need to store your session. So if that's a concern, just pick a lower setting that matches your project requirements. Now, Pro Tools supports up to 192 kilohertz if you have the right interface. And most professional audio engineers will select a sampling rate above 44.1 kilohertz, but 44.1 is an acceptable sampling rate for some projects since it's the standard sampling rate for audio CDs. However, most engineers will track, mix, and or they'll master in a higher sampling rate, and then they'll reduce the sampling rate for the purpose of a CD. So this is because higher sampling rates give you a much better frequency response. Like you get better harmonics representation and just a better sound quality overall. It'll sound clearer, you know? So anyway, based on your storage capabilities and project requirements, make a call about what sampling rate to choose. It's also good to know, like on a side note, that while the standard for CDs is 44.1 kilohertz, the standard for film is actually 48 kilohertz. So I'll just kind of show you the options before we move on here. But if you click on sampling rate, it opens up these different options. I don't have any sort of interface hooked up to my system that would give me a higher sampling rate, but it is possible. Okay. So now let's choose our input and output settings, which is also known as I/O settings, right? So these options give you presets for input and output configurations. So you'll have options for creating surround sound, like the Pro Tools HD option, which is called 5.1 Mix I/O, and you'll have options for creating a stereo mix. So you should select the stereo mix option when you're creating audio for consumer market. So in other words, for audio that will be processed into and then consumed in a CD format or MP3 format, or just something similar. That's like ultimately, if it becomes a stereo track, then you probably want this setting. So I usually just leave my session on last used though, because that's a system that works for me. So that option does basically what you think it does, right? It uses the settings from your last session. But anyway, for quite some time here, we will be working as if you're in the stereo mix setting. So I would recommend selecting that. Okay, so let's cover bit depth finally. So as of Pro Tools 10, we can work with 16-bit, 24-bit, or 32-bit floating point bit depths. If you want to save space on your hard drive, you can use 16-bit because it takes less disk space and it's the standard for audio CDs. But however, as we learned earlier in this course, the higher bit depths give you more dynamic range, right? So if you want a higher resolution of audio, or if you are working on something with a very quiet noise floor and a large dynamic range, so for example, classical music would fall in that category, then or it could fall in that category, then you should probably use one of the higher bit depths. If you have plenty of space on your computer, then you can always record at a higher bit depth and just dither down later. So dithering down is when you convert something recorded in a higher bit depth into a lower bit depth format. So if you need to be compatible with an older Pro Tools system, though, I wouldn't pick the 32-bit floating point option because I believe Pro Tools 9 and earlier won't be able to handle the 32-bit floating point option. Okay, so once you've picked your session parameter settings, just click the OK button to create your session. And Pro Tools will then prompt you to pick a save location and a name for your new session. So you just fill out that information and click save. So I'm going to do that. So I'm just going to hit OK. And it's saying save new session as. And I'm just going to write test here. I'm going to save it to the desktop, but you can save it anywhere. And then I'm going to hit save, and it's going to create that folder for me. So it will then open up your session, and it'll be blank if you picked create blank session, right? I think I just picked from a template, it looks like. And Pro Tools will also create that main session folder with all its components at that point, and it'll save that main session folder in the location that you choose. Okay. So that's all we have time for, but I hope you learned something new today. So next time on Pro Tools Authority, we're going to cover creating, deleting, and using tracks, and we will cover all the different track options that you have. We will also cover your cursors and playback options, and we will show you how to save and recall sessions properly. So we might even get into some of the stuff you need to know before recording and how to record. So thanks for watching Pro Tools Authority, and I hope to see you guys next time.